At the darkest moment of her life, Jesus did what no one can explain to this day. What if I told you that is there a miracle of Jesus that was never recorded in the Gospels, a story forgotten by time, but which proves the transforming power of Jesus over those who encounter him? Have you ever heard of the woman who was tormented by nightmares so intense they seemed real? Every night, she closed her eyes, hoping to rest, but woke up in terror. The same whispers, the same dark faces, the same paralysis, the same fear. She tried to escape, but how to escape from something that seemed to cross the line between dream and reality? The feeling was always the same, an invisible presence, something watching in the darkness, a weight in her chest that prevented her from moving. She tried everything, doctors, medicines, rituals. Nothing had any effect. The fear grew greater every night, stealing your peace, your sanity, your hope, until on your darkest night, when all seemed lost, she found the one who turns fear into peace, torment into rest. That night, she experienced one of Jesus's miracles, and what happened next, it was something no one could ever explain. Now, before continuing this story, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like something was nearby, even though you didn't see anything? Have you ever had a dream that seemed more real than it should be? If so, write in the comments, "I've felt this." Your report can be the confirmation someone else needs. And before we continue, I need to tell you something important. This is the only YouTube channel dedicated to revealing unknown stories of Jesus. Exciting stories, miracles that almost no one knows about. So if you want to keep getting these awesome revelations, leave your like now and subscribe to the channel. Why What Happened That Night will give you goosebumps. In a small village surrounded by the desert and the silence of the night, a woman lived in a world that no one else seemed to see. During the day, everything went on as usual. The sun burned the arid land, the residents followed their simple routines, and life seemed to drag on amid the heat and dust that danced with the dry wind. But when the sun set and night descended over the village, something changed. The darkness brought with it an invisible weight, a suffocating silence that made even the most skeptical people avoid leaving the house. It was at that moment that the nightmares came to get her. The shadows of the night seemed to hide something only she could see. The mud walls and small stone houses were not enough to protect her from what was chasing her. There were no locks, doors, or walls to block anything that came towards them. When she closed her eyes, the visions mixed with reality, and she no longer knew what was a dream and what was real. The wind whistled through the narrow streets, but for her it wasn't just the wind. There was something else, something that seemed to move in the darkness, lurking, waiting for the right moment to approach. In the village, people saw her as a quiet, reserved woman, always with deep circles under her eyes and a distant look. She walked like someone carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, always tired, always immersed in thoughts that no one could understand. And how could they? For them, the night was just the night. But for her, it was a battlefield. In the first few weeks, he tried to hide what was happening. Maybe it was just tiredness. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But the nights turned into months, and the months into years. She began to avoid contact with others, as no one believed her. What could you say? That something came into your house every night? What voices whispered in your ear, calling your name? That she felt invisible hands touching her skin while she was trapped, unable to move. They would laugh, say it was just imagination. But she knew the truth. Loneliness grew inside her, as did fear. Each night that passed seemed to take away a piece of his sanity. The weight on his chest increased, and the feeling of always being on the verge of despair became unbearable. She avoided sleeping, did everything she could to stay awake, but the human body has its limits. And when she finally gave in to tiredness, she was dragged back to that same nightmare. The candles that he kept lit at night flickered without any wind. The dark corners of his house seemed to lengthen, as if something was lurking, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Sometimes I would wake up and find objects out of place, as if someone had been there while I slept. Other times, he saw marks on his own body, fine scratches, bruises that he couldn't remember causing. She tried to get help, first with the elders of the village, those who knew ancient stories and knew about things that could not be seen with the naked eye. But all he heard were murmurs, empty advice, and suspicious looks. Afterwards, he sought out healers, who gave him herbs and amulets. Nothing worked. Doctors said it was exhaustion, that his body and mind were overworked. They prescribed rest. They said that everything would pass with time. But how can you rest when sleep itself is your enemy? How could we wait for time to resolve something that seemed to grow stronger and stronger? She began to fear the sunset. When the sky turned red and the first stars appeared, his heart raced. The night air felt heavier to her than to anyone else. House, which should have been a refuge, became a prison where she was completely alone with what was chasing her. And then, one day, she noticed something terrifying. The nightmares were changing. They were no longer just echoes of the past or unrecognizable figures. Now she saw faces, eyes that glowed in the dark, mouths that whispered words she couldn't understand, but that somehow struck her like sharp blades. And more than that, something inside her began to change. The whispers that once seemed to come from outside began to echo inside his own mind. The feeling of being watched no longer disappeared with the light of day. Even among people, at the fair, in the market, in the square, she felt that something was walking beside her, a shadow that no one else saw. Despair took over his soul. She was no longer the same. His faith, his strength, everything seemed to be slipping away like sand between his fingers. And then, that night, at the height of her exhaustion, she did something she had never done before. She knelt down. There was no one else to turn to, no answer, no solution. There was only one thing left, to cry out for something greater. His trembling hands clasped themselves together, and his voice, weak and almost hopeless, whispered a prayer. She didn't remember when it all started, just that. After a certain point, the nights became a torment. Every time the sun set, a chill took over his chest. Fatigue dominated her. Her body cried out for rest, but her mind knew that sleep meant opening the doors to something that waited for her in the darkness. When I closed my eyes, the nightmares came back, and every night, they were more intense. At first, they were just disturbing images, shadows moving, faceless figures whispering disjointed words, sensations she couldn't explain. But then, they started to take shape. She saw places she had never been to, people she didn't know. She felt the touch of something invisible, as if she were ripped away from reality and transported to a world where fear was the only real thing. There were times when I would wake up in the middle of the night, in a cold sweat, with tears streaming down my face without even remembering why I was crying. Other times, she would wake up with a start, with the absolute certainty that there was someone there, standing in the darkness of the room watching her. But when his eyes adjusted to the dim light, there was nothing, just the suffocating silence and the ragged breathing, the heart beating so hard it felt like it was about to explode. She no longer knew what was real and what was a dream. There were nights when I woke up and felt like I was still in the nightmare. His senses felt confused, his mind scrambled. Sometimes I saw figures in the corners of the room even after getting out of bed. Other times she heard voices murmuring her name even though she was awake. He began to wonder if he was going crazy. Was it all just inside his head? Had his mind crossed a limit from which there was no turning back? People around him noticed that something was wrong. Some asked if she was sick. Others whispered as she passed, making guesses about what might be happening. But no one knew the truth. Nobody would understand. How can he explain that his own dreams were destroying his life, that something invisible tormented her every night, stealing her peace, undermining her sanity? So she was silent. She kept everything to herself, carrying that weight alone without knowing how long she could bear it. She tried to fight. You tried to hold on to your faith. For a while, he believed that it was just a phase, that it was enough to be strong, that it wouldn't last forever. But the days turned into weeks, the weeks turned into months, and nothing changed. His prayers seemed to be lost in the void. Sometimes she would kneel for hours, asking for help, crying out for relief, but the answer never came. Silence was his only company, and little by little, doubt began to creep into his heart. Did anyone hear her? Was there really a God watching over her? She felt abandoned, as if she was fighting something much bigger than she could handle, with no one to help her. His faith, once unshakable, was now fragile like glass about to break. She began to wonder if there was something wrong with her. Did he deserve to go through that? Had he done something to attract that torment? Or was there simply no way out? She stopped praying. He stopped asking for help. She stopped believing she could be saved. The nights became endless. The day was just a pause between nightmares, a break before everything started. Again. Then something happened, something she didn't expect. And now I want to know, have you ever felt like your mind was betraying you? That something seemed too real to be just imagination? Write in the comments, I know what it's like. Your report may be exactly what someone else needs to read. And what comes next could change everything. That night, something different happened. From the moment the sun started to set, she already felt that something was wrong. The air seemed thicker, as if a storm was about to form, but the sky remained clean, starry, silent. The wind that always blew through the village streets was absent. There was no sound of dry leaves moving, nor the rustle of market stalls. Everything seemed suspended, as if time itself was holding its breath. She tried to ignore that feeling, convinced herself that it was just another night like the others. But deep down, I knew something was about to happen. His body was more tired than ever. His eyes burned with exhaustion. His head throbbed. I just wanted that night to go by quickly. She just wished that by some miracle she could sleep without nightmares finding her. But when he lay down and closed his eyes, he didn't fall asleep like other times. She felt like she was being pulled into something much bigger than herself. The darkness around him wasn't just the absence of light. It was something alive, dense, heavy, as if being swallowed by an endless void. Suddenly the whispers started. First, distant, almost inaudible, like an echo coming from far away. But as his body sank into that forced sleep, the voices became clearer. They called for her, but it was no ordinary calling. They were cold, emotionless voices, speaking her name in a way that seemed to eat away at her insides. She tried to move, but her body was paralyzed. She felt a crushing weight on her chest, as if something invisible was there, watching her, trapping her, preventing any reaction. Her breathing became short, shallow, and despair grew inside her like an uncontrollable fire. He tried to open his eyes, but he couldn't. He tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. And then, something touched his face. It was a light touch, almost delicate, but filled with a dark presence. It was as if invisible fingers were running over her skin, analyzing, testing, feeding on the terror that was growing inside her. The touch traveled down his neck, pressing against his throat. Panic took over his body. She felt like she was being suffocated, as if something was trying to take the last spark of life from her. The voices began to laugh. It was a low, hoarse laugh, filled with something she couldn't understand, but it chilled her blood. The environment around you has changed. It was no longer just a dark void. Now, she saw distorted shapes appearing on the horizon of her mind, faces without eyes, mouths open in silent screams. Hands reaching out from the ground, trying to grab her, pull her, take her. Somewhere her mind couldn't conceive. She tried to fight, tried to wake up, tried to free herself from what was holding her back. But nothing worked. And then, for the first time, he felt there was no way out. The fear he felt every night was nothing compared to what he felt at that moment. That presence didn't just want to terrify her. I wanted to destroy her. I wanted to break her from the inside, rip out her essence, reduce her soul to nothing. And it was at that moment that something inside her broke. She was exhausted, not just physically, but in a way that no words could describe. Months, years of fighting against something invisible, something that pursued her relentlessly. His strength had been exhausted. The feeling of loneliness weighed like an impossible burden to carry. And then she just gave up. He stopped fighting. He stopped trying to wake up. He let himself go. If that was his destiny, then so be it. Let it end once and for all. But the moment she accepted the end, something unexpected happened. The laughing voices stopped. The weight on his chest disappeared. The suffocating feeling gave way to something different. A light, faint at first, began to grow around him. It was not a light like the ones we know. It wasn't just glitter. It was hot. It was presence. The shadows around him began to retreat as if they were forced away. The whispers became frightened murmurs, as if something that had previously dominated the situation was now being confronted. It was at that moment that she heard a new sound, a voice. But this time it wasn't a cold whisper or a cruel laugh. It was a firm, serene voice, but filled with something she couldn't understand. And that voice called his name. For the first time since the nightmares began, she felt true relief. He felt like someone was there, as if I were no longer alone. And then he felt a touch. But this touch was different from the first. It wasn't cold. It wasn't suffocating. It didn't bring despair. It was a touch of compassion. And the moment she felt it, something inside her woke up. She opened her eyes. He was back in his room. But something had changed. The silence around him was different. It was no longer oppressive, no longer full of lurking, invisible presences. For the first time in a long time, the night just felt like night. She sat on the bed, her body still trembling, her breathing uneven. But when he touched his own face, he realized he was crying. But they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of something she couldn't explain. That night, she had a dream worse than any she had ever had. But it was also the first time he felt like maybe, just maybe, this could come to an end. Now tell me, have you ever had a dream so real that it seemed impossible to forget? A dream that left marks, even after waking up? Share your experience in the comments. Your report could be the confirmation that someone else needs to understand that they are not alone. I'm sure this story of Jesus has already moved you so far, so you need to continue, because what comes next could change everything. That morning, even after waking up, something inside her was still shaking. The room looked the same as always, the stone walls, the wooden window ajar, the cold wind blowing through the cracks. But she knew nothing was the same. What had happened that night? What was that voice? Who had called her? And why, after so long, for the first time, did the early morning silence not seem suffocating? She stood up slowly, her body still carrying the weight of the night before. He walked to the basin of water in the corner of the room, washed his face and looked at his reflection. His eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark circles, but there was something there, a spark that I hadn't seen in a long time. A strange feeling, as if you were on the verge of an answer you never imagined existed. But what answer? Questions pounded his mind. That was the worst night of all, the moment when everything seemed to fall apart, when he completely gave up. But in the midst of despair, something held her back. Something pushed back the shadows, broke the cycle of terror, pulled her out of the abyss into which she was sinking. What if that presence had been real? She needed answers. For the first time in a long time, she felt the need to talk about what was happening. She no longer wanted to keep everything to herself. She could no longer bear it alone. I needed someone to say something, anything that would bring meaning to what I was experiencing. He left the house with hesitant steps, the sun already high in the sky, people moving hurriedly through the village, women carrying pitchers of water, children running through the dirt streets, men discussing commerce. The world continued its flow, indifferent to the storm that raged within it. The first place he visited was the house of an older woman known for her wisdom. Some said she knew ancient secrets, that she understood, things that ordinary eyes could not see. When she arrived, she was greeted with a heavy look, as if the old woman already knew that her visit was no coincidence. She sat down opposite the woman and for the first time spoke. She told about the dreams, about the voices, about the feeling of always being watched. He described the shadows that crept across his room, the goosebumps that took over his skin even during the day. He recounted every detail of the nights he woke up breathless, feeling invisible hands pressing on his chest. The old woman listened to her in silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't show surprise. He just waited until all the words had been said. When silence finally filled the space between them, the older woman took a deep breath and responded with something that made her shudder. This is no ordinary dream. There are forces that walk among us, some seen, some unseen, but they all know who we are. They feed on fear, on weariness, on doubt. You have given them exactly what they want. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. It gave, like this. It wasn't your fault. She never chose that. She never wanted to feel that terror every night. How could you be feeding something against your own will? If they feed on my fear, how do I stop them? The old woman looked at her with a seriousness that made her stomach turn. Maybe you're looking for answers in the wrong places. It made her shudder. All this time, he had looked for doctors, healers, wise men, anyone who could give him an explanation. But nothing worked. And now this woman told him that the problem was not the search, but where she was looking for. It was then that she heard something that made her shiver from head to toe. Maybe only he can help you. She immediately understood who the woman was talking about. Jesus. His thoughts conflicted. She had already heard of him. The village whispered about this man's deeds, about the miraculous cures, about the words that touched the soul. Some said he was a prophet, others called him a deceiver, but there were also those who whispered something that made her shudder. Son of God. His heart raced. Something inside her wanted to believe. Something screamed that this was the answer. But what if it wasn't? What if it was just another empty hope, like so many others he sought? But what if even he can't save me? The doubt came quickly, like a reflex. How could she trust? He had spent endless nights crying out, begging for help, and all he received was silence. Why would it be any different now? The elderly woman just smiled slightly and got up, going to a small chest in the corner of the room. From there, he took out a piece of fabric and handed it to her. When he opened it, he saw a simple piece of cloth worn by time. This was given by someone who heard him preach. He wiped a blind man's eyes with a cloth similar to this. When all seemed lost, when there was no hope, a simple touch from him changed everything. She held the fabric between her fingers and felt a shiver run down her spine. I didn't know if it was real. I didn't know if I could believe it. But something inside her whispered a frightening truth. If that were true, then maybe she was wrong all along. Maybe the help was always there, just waiting for her to accept it. But still, fear kept her from believing completely. She left the old woman's house carrying that doubt in her chest. He walked aimlessly through the streets, feeling the fabric between his fingers, as if that could give him an answer. And that was when he realized, ever since he left that woman's house, something was different. The feeling of being watched seemed weaker. The weight on his shoulders was no longer so suffocating. The fear was still there, but it was like something was starting to change. It could be coincidence, or it could be a sign, but she wasn't ready to accept it so easily. And you? Have you ever felt like you were looking for answers in the wrong places? Have you ever had the feeling that something was trying to show you a path, but fear wouldn't let you believe? Comment here. I need answers. and stay tuned, because what comes next could change everything. That morning, the feeling was different. The weight she carried on her shoulders was still there, but something inside her seemed to have moved. It was as if, for the first time in years, a small crack had appeared in the darkness that enveloped her. What happened last night couldn't just be a dream. She felt it. It was real. The touch, the presence, the voice that called her. She stood up slowly, as if any sudden movement could dissipate the slightest hope that was beginning to grow within her. He looked at the stone walls of his house, at the dark corners that once seemed to hide something lurking, but this time he wasn't afraid. And then the old woman's words came back to him. Maybe only he can help you. Jesus. She had already heard of him. Many talked about a man who healed the sick, who touched the blind and made them see, a man who cast out evil spirits and freed those who were trapped by unseen forces. But could Jesus help her? She who had already tried everything? The thought consumed her for hours until, on impulse, she decided to leave. She didn't know exactly where Jesus was, but rumors said he had been seen in the neighboring town, surrounded by a crowd. His heart sped up. Would I have the courage? What if he looked at her and saw nothing? What if you said that your suffering was just a fruit of your mind? Fear tried to hold her back, but something stronger pushed her forward. She walked under the scorching sun, each step laced with anxiety and hope. Sweat dripped down her skin, but she didn't stop. His mind repeated a single sentence. What if it's true? When he got close to the city, he noticed the commotion. People running, raised voices, murmurs running through the streets. She approached slowly, trying to understand. Jesus was there. She saw the crowd surrounding him, dozens of people pushing to get closer. Some cried, others screamed, many just looked in silence, as if they knew they were facing something much bigger than they could understand. She stopped. Your whole body told you to run to him, but your mind screamed otherwise. What if he can't help me? His heart was pounding. The memories of the nightmares came flooding back. The endless nights of terror, the shadows that surrounded her. The voices that whispered her name. How could I believe that one man could change all of this? And it was then that Jesus saw her. In the middle of the crowd, among so many unknown faces, Jesus looked directly at her. Time seemed to stop. It was as if, in that instant, all the weight disappeared. The cold that always enveloped her disappeared. The fear that paralyzed her evaporated. That look, she had never seen anything like it. He didn't just see her, he saw her. I saw everything, every pain, every wound, each night spent in despair. He knew. Her legs gave way and she fell to her knees. The crying came before he could contain it. And then he spoke. Daughter, why are you so afraid? The sound of his voice was like a balm on their invisible wounds. It was soft, but carried an authority that cut through your soul. She tried to speak, but she couldn't. How to explain, how to put into words everything I had experienced. But somehow, I knew he already understood. Jesus took a step towards him. She felt her entire body shudder. Something inside her was about to break. He extended his hand, and at that moment, everything inside her screamed for her to accept it. But the fear was still there, the fear of believing and being disappointed, the fear of waiting and continuing to live in emptiness, the fear that even he couldn't save her. But when he looked back into his eyes, he saw something he had never seen before. Certainty. He knew. He had no doubt. He wasn't asking if he could save her. He was just waiting for her to accept it. And at that moment, something inside her surrendered. She extended her hand, and when his fingers touched hers, she felt something she could never describe. It was as if everything inside her had been ripped away, as if years of pain had dissolved into thin air. The weight disappeared. Fear disappeared. The shadows that haunted her were dissipated like smoke. She felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. The voices had disappeared. The darkness was gone. The cold, the despair, the pain, everything went away. At that moment she knew she was free. Now tell me, what if it were you? What would you do if you had the chance to reach out and feel all the fear disappear? Leave your answer in the comments. I'm sure you're loving this unknown story of Jesus. So stay tuned, because what comes next could change everything. The moment his fingers touched hers, it was as if time ceased to exist. A different heat coursed through her body, starting with her hands, moving up her arms, spreading like a living current that pulsed inside her. But it was no ordinary heat. It wasn't something physical. It was something much bigger. It was as if, for the first time, a light was invading the darkest places of his soul. She felt her knees give way, not out of weakness, but as if his body finally understood that it no longer needed to fight. The voices that once echoed in his mind, whispering fears, disappeared completely. The cold that enveloped her every night, that made her bones shiver, disappeared. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't frightening. On the contrary, it was welcoming. The woman looked up and saw Jesus looking at her. And in that look, there was something that no words could describe. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask for explanations. He did not question his faith. He simply looked into it. And in that look, there was an undeniable truth. Jesus knew. He knew every nightmare. I knew every time she woke up crying in a cold sweat, screaming in the dark, feeling suffocated by something invisible. He knew the countless nights he tried to fight, when his soul screamed for help and all he found was silence. He knew everything. And yet, there was Jesus, no condemnation, no reproach, without looking at her as broken, impure, or irreparable. He saw her like no one had ever seen her, and then his voice sounded again. "Daughter, why are you so afraid?" The words entered her, hard like a blade cutting through all the chains that bound her. Why? Why was she still afraid? She tried to respond, but no words came out. How to explain? How can you say that fear was all you knew? That he had been a part of her for so long, that even now, feeling Jesus' presence, it was still hard to believe he could just walk away. But then, Jesus lightly squeezed his hand. It was a simple touch, but it was like waking up from a forever nightmare. The weight crushing his chest evaporated. The shadow that followed her disappeared. The despair that lived inside her was ripped away, as if it had never existed, and for the first time since it all started, she took a deep breath and felt peace. His entire body shook. She looked at her own hands, hoping to see some sign, some mark of what had haunted her for so long. But there was nothing, no trace of darkness, no memory of the pain. Tears started to roll down your face. But this time, they weren't tears of fear. They were not tears of despair. They were tears of something she didn't know she would ever feel again: relief. She fell to her knees before him. Her entire body surrendered to that presence that enveloped her like an invisible embrace. The ground beneath his feet felt safe. The light around her was so intense that she could no longer remember the darkness that tormented her before. And there, kneeling before him, she realized that there were no more questions. She didn't need to understand. I didn't need explanations. All that mattered was that presence. She was no longer alone. Jesus continued looking at her, a look of pure love, a look of someone who already knew this would happen, who waited for this moment. He didn't say anything else. It wasn't necessary, because in that moment she understood. What happened to her was not just a momentary relief. It wasn't just a brief rest before the nightmares returned. It was a complete liberation. What tormented her every night no longer existed. The power that fear had over her was broken. She had been healed. What once seemed impossible was now his new reality. And there, before him, all he could say was a single word: thanks. And Jesus smiled. Have you ever felt something that seemed impossible to overcome? Something that haunted you, that suffocated you, that made you believe that you would never have peace? Comment here. I choose peace. Because just as this woman was freed, I believe this can be her reality from now on. I'm sure This story is touching you, so stay with me, because what comes next could be even deeper. That night, when I returned home, everything seemed different. The streets of the village remained the same, the small stone houses, the distant noise of voices talking, the cold wind blowing through the narrow alleys. But something inside her had changed. It wasn't just the memory of what happened. It wasn't just his touch. It was a silent certainty, something she couldn't explain, but she felt in every part of her body. She took a deep breath, trying to absorb everything that had happened. Her feet were dirty from the road. Her knees were marked from the moment she knelt before him. But none of that mattered, because for the first time, the weight he had always carried was no longer there. She entered the house and looked around. For years, that place had been his refuge and his prison. Every corner seemed to hide shadows. Every object seemed to carry the memory of the terrifying nights he faced. But now, everything seemed normal. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was no longer that void filled with invisible presences that suffocated her. For the first time, there was no fear inside her. She approached the small table in the center of the room and touched the worn wood, as if testing whether it was all real, as if he needed to confirm that it was really there, that it was no longer an illusion, another fragment of his nightmares. But everything was exactly as it always was. The difference was that this time I wasn't afraid. The sky was already starting to darken. The sun slowly set over the horizon, dyeing everything with golden and orange tones. This was always the time of day when her heart raced, when dread began to creep up inside her, because it meant only one thing: the night was coming. But this time, she felt nothing. No anguish, no anticipation of the terror that would come when he closed his eyes, just a silent peace. She lit a candle and sat by, the small window watching the sky darken. The stars slowly emerged one by one, shining in the immensity, and she noticed something she had never noticed before. The night was beautiful. For so many years, darkness had been his enemy. The night was the time when she was most vulnerable, when her strength was exhausted and the nightmares came to get her. But now, for the first time, she felt something different. He felt gratitude. She closed her eyes, and, without realizing it, a smile appeared on her lips. Slowly, he got up and went to his bed. His fingers touched the sheets, feeling the fabric under his hands. For so long, lying down meant fighting a battle against something she didn't understand. But now everything was different. She lay down slowly, feeling the softness of the mattress. His heart was calm, your breathing calm, no anxiety, no presence around, no shadow waiting in the darkness. Then he closed his eyes and slept. He slept like he hadn't slept in years. No interruptions, no shocks, no waking up suffocated by terror, just deep, true, restorative rest. And that night, there were no nightmares. No voice called her in the middle of the night. No shadow crept into his dreams. No icy chill ran down his spine. Just silence, just peace. And when the morning sun touched her skin, she woke up slowly, without fear, without despair. He sat down on the bed, ran his hands over his arms, as if trying to feel if something was still different. But everything was as it should be. She was free. The miracle wasn't just the absence of nightmares. It wasn't just freedom from what tormented her. It was the fact that, for the first time, I felt like I belonged to the light. She was no longer a prisoner of darkness. The woman got up and opened the window, letting the sun invade every corner of the room. He took a deep breath and smiled, because for the first time in years, she was at peace. And you? Have you ever been afraid to sleep? Have you ever faced something that seemed impossible to overcome? Write your experience in the comments below. Your experience could help thousands of people who are going through this same situation. Now, what comes next could be even more transformative. What does this story teach us? She teaches us that fear can imprison us. It can rob us of peace. It can make us believe that we will never be free. But it also teaches us that there is something greater than fear. There is a name that can dispel any darkness. There is a touch that can break any chain. What this woman experienced was not just a nightly torment. It was an invisible prison, a battle that consumed her inside, a weight that no one else could see, but that she carried day after day. And how often does this happen to us too? How many times do we feel like we are struggling with something that no one else understands? How many times do we carry burdens in silence, believing we will never find relief? This woman tried everything. He sought rational explanations, sought help in every possible place, but nothing changed until the moment she met Jesus. And that is the most powerful truth of this story. The encounter with Jesus changes everything. She didn't need to explain her pain. He didn't need to describe his sleepless nights, his despair, his paralyzing fear. The moment Jesus looked at her, he already knew. I knew exactly what she had been through. I knew about the tears that no one saw, the prayers that seemed unheard. She knew how tired she was, that made her want to give up. And yet he called her daughter. Daughter, why are you so afraid? How many times does Jesus ask us this same question? How many times do we let fear stop us from seeing what he has already prepared for us? Because fear paralyzes us. He makes us doubt. It makes us think that we are alone, that there is no way out, that we are destined to live this way forever. But this story teaches us that fear does not have the final say. Jesus still holds hands today. He still calls people by name. He still looks into the eyes of those who are broken and lost and says, "Son, daughter, why are you so afraid?" What if he is asking this of you today? Maybe, like this woman, you are experiencing something that seems impossible to resolve. Maybe you are facing nights without peace, days without hope. Maybe you're tired of trying, of searching, of fighting alone. But what if all he's waiting for is for you to reach out? What if, right now, Jesus is ready to hold your hand, dispel your darkness, and show you that there is a way out of this fear? Because what this woman discovered that night wasn't just freedom from nightmares, it was something much bigger. She discovered that never been alone. That all this time, while I cried in the dark, while I cried out without answers, while I tried to understand why nothing changed, Jesus was there, waiting for the moment when she was ready to trust. And when he finally trusted, everything changed. The darkness that seemed eternal disappeared. The terror that consumed her lost its power. The fear that seemed uncontrollable was replaced by something she thought she would never feel again: peace. And that peace didn't come because she understood everything. He didn't come because he found a rational explanation for what he experienced. It came because, for the first time, she gave herself completely into his hands. And that's the big question. What's stopping you from doing the same? How many times do we let our fears dominate us? How many times do we refuse to reach out because we are afraid of what might happen? Fear of believing and being disappointed. Fear of waiting and remaining empty. Fear that even he cannot save us. But if Jesus looked at you today and asked, "Why are you so afraid?" what would you answer? What is stopping you from trusting? What still keeps you stuck? Fear only has power as long as we believe we are alone. Fear only grows as we refuse to trust. But the moment we reach out, the moment we choose to believe, the impossible happens. This woman was completely transformed, not because he found answers, but because he found Jesus. And he still does this today. He still enters houses where there is oppressive silence. It still touches those who believe they will never be free. He still looks into the eyes of those who carry the weight of the world and says, "Son, daughter, I'm here." And that could be your reality. Now tell me, is Jesus trying to hold your hand today? If this story spoke to you, if something inside you moved as you listened to each word, write in the comments, "I trust in you, Jesus." Because that could be your statement today, your response to fear, your choice to live something new. This story comes to you for a reason. Some words speak directly to our soul, as if they were made especially for us. I'm sure you felt this, and if something inside you moved while listening to every detail, then you are already a part of this space where rare and transformative stories are revealed. And I know this message makes sense to you. What happened to this woman was not just a retelling of the past. It is a living reminder that there is something bigger happening all around us. So stay close, because stories like this are rare and almost no one talks about them. Jesus lived incredible moments, full of mysteries and teachings that transform lives to this day. And here you have access to these stories that few know. But that's just the beginning. There's so much more waiting for you. Have you heard about the day when Jesus saved a child from a raging river? It was a moment of pure despair, where everything seemed lost until something incredible happened. Click now on the next video and discover this exciting story. I'm sure this story of Jesus touched you, so have you subscribed to the channel to continue following incredible stories about Jesus? Activate the bell so you don't miss anything. There is much more waiting for you, only here on The Hidden Stories of Jesus.
Thank you.